Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Being the last speaker in the last session reminds me of the story of a guy who walks into a big room and finds only one person sitting in the front listening to his speech, and he waits, nobody shows up, so his time is up, so he starts speaking, and he gives a speech, and the person in the front was giving good responses to his speech. He was laughing, smiling, agreeing, disagreeing, clapping, and at the end, he went up and finished his speech and thanked the person in the front and said to him, I really appreciate the fact that you sat there so patiently listening to my speech. And started moving out of the room, and he says, where are you going? And he said, well, I'm just finished with my speech. He said, no, you're not going anywhere. I am the last speaker. So just putting in context the presentation that Dr. Darwish has just provided, I was asked to put in perspective the current status of the economies of the Arab world. And I'll talk a little bit about that and talk about the region's response to the challenges it is facing today. We all know about the political and violence and wars that the region is engaged in, but little and less is being discussed about the status of the economy and how to put this in context. And then in the end, I will try to see if I could, having described all the problems that the region faces, looking at the opportunities that exist, and much of the talk during this forum has been on the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'll try to put that in context. The Arab world is a very varied and diverse group of countries. They differ in size, they differ in level and structure of their economies. They differ in population. They differ obviously from the resource endowment they have. And therefore, I'm not going to get into the details of all of these countries. I will try to group them as much as possible to the extent that despite the diversity and despite the big differences that they have from countries like Egypt, very big and large population, to a country like Qatar, which is a small but very wealthy economy, they share quite a bit in common. And they share quite a bit in common, so much so that their economic cycles tend to be up and down almost the same way. All the work that I have done in this region for the last 40 plus years shows that whether you're rich or poor, whether you're big or small, your economy almost follows the same cyclical patterns with few leads and lags in there. So they share cyclical natures in the economy. They share quite a bit of other characteristics, not all of which is very positive. In fact, most of it is not. They're big government and public sector dominated economies. Between 30 and 70% of all the labor force works for a government or government entity of one type or another. They have very low productivity in labor, so the whole economic structure is very poorly done. And they have a very poor and weak educational system. So because of those similarities, I tend to group them together because the solutions may be different at the margin from one to the other, but the basic panacea for their problems is very similar. Just as we discussed and have seen the conflicts that exist, political, otherwise, the economic challenges that the region faces are far more serious, and they are far more irreversible. Other times they have gone through ups and downs in their economy, as most countries in the world have. This time they're facing challenges that are totally different and irreversible in nature. And what I have argued in other writings I have done is that the principal challenge they have is a technological disruption. Many of you know that this is the 10th anniversary of the introduction of the iPhone. Many of us don't think that life existed before a smartphone of some kind of another. And the introduction of this iPhone and these smartphones in general have brought into the hands of every man, woman, literally man, woman, and child in this world, a communication device that has multi-purpose and that has disrupted and changed the way we've done things. Much in the same way communication and technology has been impacted by these kind of disruptions, the energy sector has been disrupted quite a bit by that. That has impacted the way we produce, the way we consume, and the way we utilize energy. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through a lot of details except to say that the technology is only 10 years old. And yet, in those 10 years, very short time, just like the iPhone, we're able to access reservoirs of oil and gas that we could not have done in the last 200 years. We do it cheaper, we do it more efficiently, and we do it without environmental disruption of the type that we would have faced in the past. We could now produce far more out of the same reservoir of oil than we could have done even 10 or 15 years ago. So that is on the production side of the equation. If you're an oil producer, this is bad news. On the consumption side, the United States is the biggest consumer per capita of energy in the world. And yet, because of a whole bunch of measures, from conservation to efficiency to new sources of energy, we're now consuming on a per capita basis 20% less than we have merely 15 years ago. That trend is spreading throughout the world. It's beginning to spread into Europe, it's spreading into Asia, it's in China, everywhere else. I mean, we're going to see that efficiency continuing to improve, and that reduces the consumption. We're also obviously changing the way we're utilizing energy. Everybody talks about the electric cars. In this morning's China Daily, you see that Tesla will be producing electric cars here in China. China owns Volvo, and Volvo will go completely electric within the next 15 to 20 years. All of those combine to create a situation in which supply is more abundant, demand is declining, alternatives are replacing existing things, and the whole trend for the future looks pretty grim if you are a producer of oil, and the Middle East is a very large portion of the oil source. There's an outlet associated with Stanford University in California called Rethink X. They're projecting that within 15 years, that 95% of all vehicle miles that are used in urban centers in the United States will be used through rideshare, Uber-like system. So people will own less cars, and they will reuse more of community-owned cars owned by fleets that will have a lot more efficiency, a lot more economy. And the bottom line of that is that it's going to reduce consumption and the use of vehicles in general by between 30 and 40% within 15 to 20 years. Now, the region has obviously waken up to those facts, and all oil producers have. And they started adopting measures, some of which are reasonable and rational, some of which are less. I don't know if some of you remember the old American TV comedy show called I Love Lucy. For those of you who remember that, and for those of you who don't, Ricky Ricardo, Lucy's husband, in real life and on television, comes into the apartment and finds his wife on fours looking for something in the living room, and he says, "What are you doing?" She said, "I'm looking for my earrings. I've lost one of my earrings." And so he starts looking with her, and he says to her, "Where exactly did you lose it? Here?" She said, "No, I lost my earring in the bedroom." "And why?" He said, "Are you looking for the earring in this room?" And he says, "Well, because the light is much better over here." So the region is looking for some easy solutions, some of which go counter-intuitive to economic orthodoxy, reducing budgets, cutting spending, laying off people, and looking forward into trying to privatize and reduce the role of the government and by diversifying its economy and making more and more burden shared by the private sector. They're reducing subsidies, and what's happening in the region is far more revolutionary than most people think. And the reason why I say that is that because the region has lived, the Middle East in general, has lived on subsidies and essentially a welfare state. The government provided everything or provided most things, made it cheaper and more easy for the citizens to acquire those wealth. That model is about to be out. And in doing that, the entire economic system and the entire social system and the entire political system is going to change very radically. And it spells for some bumps in the road and air pockets over the next several years. So I'm going to cut to the chase and get to the bottom line. Things look pretty bad now, and they'll look probably worse for the next, maybe 5, 6, 7 years. But we're here in China, and China thinks in the long term. And I started thinking about the long term. Is this region dead, and therefore we should look for funeral arrangements, or is this region in difficult time, and therefore at some point or the other, it's going to come up with remedies and solutions. And I happen to think, being an eternal optimist, that the second is true. And let me just give you a sense about the region. The region as a whole, the Arab world alone, that stretches from Iran and the Persian Gulf on the east, all the way to Morocco and Tunisia and Egypt on the west. It spans 2 continents. It has roughly about 400 million people. That population is growing roughly around 3% per year. So it doesn't require a PhD in mathematics to recognize that within 35 years, by the year 2050 something, not a long time, the region will have 800 million people. Another 35 years, before the turn of the century, 2085, 2090, there will be 1.6 billion Arabs living in that region. They share, despite their differences and despite the conflicts that was just discussed by my colleague before, ultimately share quite a bit in common. They share culture, they share religion, they share language, they share arts, they share a variety of things. And ultimately, this is a very massive regional bloc. Depends on how you look at population over the next 50 to 70 years. It will be either the second largest or the third largest block of population in the world, India, China, and the Arab world. Basically, that's what it is. So to me, this is a huge, massive block of consumers. It's a geopolitical as well as economic and social block. That's an opportunity. And it's an opportunity that comes once every century. And it's an opportunity that I think is ripe for a country like China. As we're discussing, the concept of the Belt and Road, not just a physical concept of connecting highways and ports and whatever, but it's a concept of development, a concept of participating in the rebuilding and restructuring of the region. The governments of the region are in a panic, and when you're in a panic, you do things to move fast. And moving fast meaning that the governments will start selling very quickly public assets, and they're going to sell it as quickly as possible. And at the time when they have to do that, they will end up selling it cheaper and less costly than otherwise under normal circumstances. This thing we have experienced in Russia. We've experienced that in several Eastern European countries. We experienced it in Chile. So these privatization mechanisms offer opportunity for Chinese companies, Chinese entities, and other investors to acquire assets that are quite, reasonable and would have a lot of chance for growth. Um, The region also is connected in a number of agreements. If you go to Egypt, you'll find that there's a bus system in Cairo, public buses, say is made in the United Arab Emirates. Now, why does Egypt buy a car manufactured in the United Arab Emirates? The fact of the matter is that this is a Chinese company that makes car in Dubai, sells it to Egypt completely tax-free. And most Arab countries are connected to this tariff system. And my point is that it gives an opportunity to set up facilities and set up mechanisms to produce and distribute to this 500 million people now and 1.5 billion people in short 50, 70 years, that I think a country like China could benefit quite a bit. So the other thing is, obviously, because of the conflicts, you read about Syria, you read about Iraq, you read about Libya, you read about Yemen. There's a lot of bad news and a lot of destruction. But those countries, those economies are going to have to be rebuilt. And in the last 30 to 50 years, there's no country in the world, as far as I can see, that had the experience of rebuilding economy from scratch, completely from scratch, and building it at 21st century standards. That, I think, is the biggest opportunity that the region has. So I end up on a positive note, and I hope that this opportunity will really become the focus of China for the next few years. And thank you very much.